These are the colors I'll be using for today's painting. You can find a list of these exact colors in the video description, so feel free to pause the video and gather your colors. You don't have to be exact to just get somewhere close. Cadmium Yellow, Burnt Sienna, Cadmium Red, Permanent Rose, Purple Lake, Ultramarine Blue, and Burnt Umber. These are the materials I'll be using for today's floral painting. You can find a list of these materials in the video description along with timestamps so you can speed along the video to wherever you'd like. I'm going to be working on a watercolor block today. In the video description is a line drawing that you can also download as well as a reference photo so you can print them from home and work from there. I want you to print the line drawing at the scale you plan on painting it. If you have a graphite transfer sheet, that can help you get the line drawing onto your watercolor paper. Just tape the line drawing on your watercolor block, put the graphite transfer sheet in between, and then trace with a pencil or pen. The other alternative is to flip your line drawing over, apply graphite behind it, tape it in position, and trace from there. Either way, you're going to be able to get your line drawing onto your watercolor paper. Just note that if you're using the transfer paper, you want to press lighter because sometimes your lines will come out really black and you won't be able to lighten them. For today's subject, we don't want any real dark lines on this center flower because it has such soft pinks in the coloring. So for myself, I'm just going to take a quick look and make sure there are no lines that I would prefer to lighten up. If there are, then I take a moment like now to do so. The other flowers are darker in value, so I'm not so much worried about the pencil lines there. I'm now going to use my number 10 round to get some paint or some water over to my palette so I can mix some paint. I'm going to be mixing up a few different colors. So I'm putting a small amount of water on my paint palette in 4 different wells. One of the paint colors will be just a very, very soft purple pink color. So I'm going to be using Purple Lake for that. I like to use a scrap piece of paper to test out my color to make sure it's as dark as I'd like. I want it to be a little bit darker than that because I know that my color will lighten up when it dries. And that feels a little better. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix up a cadmium yellow. This color I want to be more vibrant, so I'm going to use more pigment in this mixture. But I also test that color out on a scrap piece of paper. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to now move on to mixing a darker kind of orange-red color. So I'm going to get my cadmium red. I'm going to add some Purple Lake to it. And once I feel like it's close, I'm going to test out that color. I feel pretty happy with that. I might want to go a little darker, but I want to push those values slowly. So for those 3 colors, that's what we're going to start off with. So I'm going to rinse my brush really well, and I'm going to start with this petal in the center. And I'm just going to apply clean water Within this petal, being mindful of the fold on the left side, I don't want water to get inside that fold. Now that I have water, I want to make sure there's no puddles. I want just a nice thin amount of water where I can still see the texture of the paper. And I'm now going to grab my small number 2 round to add some color to this petal. I'm going to get my purple lake on my brush, and I'm going to stay up towards the top of the petal in the right edge. And taking my time to kind of push this color right up against my pencil edge so I have neat results in the end. I can also absorb some of the paint out of my brush, and with a brush that's more dry, I can kind of push this color around in this petal to get the blends that I want. At the very bottom, I am going to rinse my brush and add some cadmium yellow. Now I make sure to, when I dip in my yellow, I wipe away the excess paint so I don't completely overtake this entire petal with yellow. If I have puddles of paint, I simply dry my brush off on my sponge and soak them up. Now that I have yellow there, I'm now going to grab the darker color, the red and purple lake, and I'm going to put just the smallest amount at the very bottom of the petal near center. I'm now going to let that petal dry and move on to the next petal. So I'm switching back to my number 10 round, getting some clean water on it, and I'm going to apply this clean water in the next petal. However, I'm going to keep the water out of the fold on the left. That way it doesn't come in contact with the petal I just painted. Now, I did not include a full line to indicate where the fold was on this petal in the reference photo or the line drawing that you downloaded. So I'm going to tip my paper to give you a better understanding of where to put the water. So just give me a quick moment and I will show you the kind of angle we want. So when I tip my paper, do you see at the very top? I want you to put water up into that curve, but bring that curve down, back out, and then come back in. And that's going to give you a nice angle for the petal fold in this particular petal. Once you have everything wet, make sure there's no puddles and switch back to your number 2 round. We're going to get some of that purple lake back on our brush. And at the very top edge, as well as the right edge, we're going to add some of that purple lake. You can always tap your brush when it has paint in it to help it release some of the color for a more vibrant color. You can also remove the paint from your brush, and with a more dry brush, you can kind of blend this color in with the water to create the gradient or shadow that you would like. Once you're happy with the purple lake, rinse your brush and switch to cadmium yellow. Don't forget to wipe your brush off on the rim of your palette before you go to your painting. That's going to help avoid puddles. I want to bring this cadmium yellow all the way down to the very center of the flower. I like to tap my brush so it releases a nice vibrant yellow. And I want this yellow to come up and kind of align with how far my yellow went on the previous petal. So I'm just kind of being mindful of that distance and trying to keep it consistent. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it off, and I'm going to get some of that dark red and purple lake mixture, wiping away the excess before I go to my painting. And I'm going to tap my brush right at the very center so I can get some of these reds in. If your reds start to travel a little far, rinse your brush and dry it off on your sponge, and use your dry, clean brush to kind of control how far those reds are going to go. And we're probably going to have to come back and darken them up later anyways, but just be mindful that they don't completely overpower your yellows. I'm moving on to the next petal. This is another one where I did not draw the actual petal fold, and that's because they were so similar in value, I didn't want to risk pencil lines being a part of the result. So I'm going to stay towards the bottom of my petal and I'm going to fill it in with water, leaving the top edge dry. And I'll tilt my paper once again so you can kind of see where I put the water. Take your time with the water. Don't rush it. I'm going to tip my paper so you can see where my water is. Notice the area I left dry for the fold in that particular petal. So just try and kind of mimic a similar shape. Make sure there's no puddles of water. That'll make it very difficult to control where your paint goes. Once you're happy and you have your water even, you're going to use your number 2 round to add some of this purple lake to the bottom edge of your petal. If there's a lot of puddling of water, that's going to dilute your color, so soak up some of those puddles if you need to. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once I have my purple lake in and I'm happy with the gradient, I'm going to rinse my brush and get some cadmium yellow, wiping away the excess before I bring it to my painting. Again, I'm trying to kind of be mindful with the length and height of my yellow, so it kind of coordinates with the previous petals that I've painted, trying to keep them a little lined up. I'm going to rinse the yellow out of my brush and tap a sponge to dry it. I'm now going to get some of that darker red and more in the center. I'm going to tap my brush on top of that wet yellow so it releases some of that red. I now need to give that area some time to dry, so I'm moving on. Switching to my number 10 round, being very mindful that I do not want my water to come in contact with the wet area of my previous petal. So I am allowing a just sliver of dry paper to be in between the two spaces. When in doubt, use a blow dryer if you must. But as long as you can have good brush control and keep your water from contacting that previous petal, you should be fine. But nothing is wrong with grabbing a blow dryer and just letting it dry. I'm going to soak up any puddling of water. I'm going to tip my paper so you can kind of see where my water is. So I did maintain just a thin sliver of dry paper in between this petal and the next, and that's just going to be a fold. There's no puddles of water, so I'm going to immediately just jump to my purple lake. I want there to be a darker color kind of through the center of this petal, so it looks like it's in shadow. You can dry your brush off on a sponge or paper towel and use that dry brush to kind of create the fades or gradients that you want on the wet surface. Once you're happy with it, rinse your brush and get some cadmium yellow on it. Just remember to wipe away the excess. Once I have some yellow down, I can rinse my brush and grab some of the dark red. Sometimes tapping your brush will help your brush release the color that you want. Now I can't paint this next petal because there is no fold really dividing it. If you want, you know what, let's just create a fold of our own. That way we can paint it and not come in contact. So clean water, we're leaving a sliver of dry watercolor paper again. So when I get to that right edge, I do not come in contact with that previous petal that I just painted. Instead, I'm going to leave just a little sliver of dry paper there. I'm making sure to soak up any puddling of water. I'm going to tip my paper so you can see where that water is. I'm switching to my number 2 round and getting some of that purple lake. And along that right edge where my water stops, I'm just adding some of that color. I'm going to rinse my brush of the purple lake, and I'm going to get some of that yellow next. Now I'm going to grab some of that cadmium yellow. And then I'm going to rinse my brush and grab some of the dark red. So while this central flower is drying, I'm going to hop over to my darker flowers on the left to begin painting. But I need to mix up the paint colors. So I'm going to get a large round brush, and I've already got some water in a couple areas of my palette that I haven't added any color to yet. And the first color I'm going to do, it's going to be quite a bit of this permanent rose pink. And I'm going to add this color to both wells, but one of these pinks I will be darkening up a little bit. So I'm being pretty heavy-handed with how much pigment I add. So I want a vibrant color. So that's where I'm at. I'm happy with that. But one of these colors I want to be a little bit more on the purple side. So I'm going to grab some of the purple lake and add it to the pink. I'm happy with that. And then the second pink, I want to be quite a bit darker. So I am going to get some of that cadmium red, add it to the pink. But I'm going to go a step further and add the smallest amount of ultramarine blue to darken it up some. And I feel good about that. So now I need to find some areas that are not in contact with anything wet before I begin painting them. I'm going to use my dirty pink paint water to add water to the petal just so you can kind of see where it is I'm working. And plus this color is not going to negatively interfere with the colors of the petals since they're all eventually going to be some form of pink. So adding water first. Before I add my paint colors, I make sure there's no puddles. Puddles are just going to dilute my colors and wash them out and make it hard for me to control. So I soak up any puddling. I'm now going to switch to I'm going to use my number 6 round. And I'm going to start with that pink and purple mixture. I'm going to use it primarily on the right edge. When I get about halfway through on this petal, I'm going to switch my colors to that darker red mixture. Notice how I'm keeping just a thin sliver of dry paper to indicate a fold. If I have puddling of paint, I dry my brush off on a paper towel or sponge so I can soak up some of that excess paint so it dries more even. I'm going to let that petal dry and move on to the next one. Being mindful of this thin sliver of white paper on the fold, I'm going to keep my water out of it, and I'm going to wet this next petal. So I'm keeping a thin sliver of dry paper in between it and the petal I just painted. If you are concerned about bumping into it, definitely hit it with a blow dryer. Once you have this petal wet, make sure there is no puddling of water. Soak that up. I'm going to get the purple pink mixture. Keep this color more towards the right, being mindful of the dry paper I want to maintain. Careful of where you rest your hand if you have wet paint. If you have puddling of paint, just dry your brush off on a paper towel or sponge and soak it up. Once you don't have any puddles, you can move on to grabbing that darker red mixture. Puddles of paint can make it difficult to stay in narrow spaces, so be mindful. If you have puddles, soak up some of that excess paint so you don't end up accidentally going wider than you intend. I'm going to make sure there's no puddles, so I'm just taking a dry brush and tapping the top surface of any puddles so it dries even and faster. This next petal, the shape is so narrow and small, I'm just going to grab that dark red and I'm going to go right onto dry paper. In order to get into tall, tight, small spaces, hold your brush more vertical and don't allow puddling. This next shape on the bottom petal is just as small. So I'm going to use that dark red mixture and I'm just going to fill it in. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. To paint this last petal here, I need to make sure I leave a thin sliver of dry paper between it and the petal above that is still wet. If you're concerned you might accidentally hit it, I recommend using a blow dryer just for peace of mind. Now on my white paper here, I have a couple areas where some of my paint ended up. So I'm just using a stiff square brush with some clean water just to soften it a bit so it's less obvious. If I want to, I can always come back to this painting at a different date and paint the background if I'd like. But I'm just going to soften that a bit. All right, I'm continuing with my number 6 round. I'm going to leave a thin sliver of dry paper so I don't come in contact with that wet petal. I'm going to tip my paper so you can see where my water stops. So there's just a thin sliver of dry paper there. Make sure there's no puddles. I'm going to grab my pink purple mixture first. I'm going to stay relatively center and towards the right edge, kind of creating a triangular shape. I'm now going to grab some of that dark red, and without coming in contact with that other petal, if you have puddling of paint, rinse your brush and dry it off on a sponge or paper towel, and use that dry brush to just tap the top surface of any puddling paint to bring it back in control. I'm grabbing just a little bit of that dark red so I can darken up a couple edges. And I'm just going to give this petal some space to dry. I'm now going to go to the dark pink flower that's behind everything. And this is a small shape. I'm really only going to be using one color on it. So I'm just going to use that pink purple. And I'm just going to fill this in by painting wet on dry. So the only time I'm really applying clean water down first on my petal is if I need gradients and transitions between different colors and values. But if it's all going to be just the same flat color and it's a small enough shape, you should be able to just go right in and paint it and then get out. The key is to not fiddle when things begin to dry. I'm going to hop over to the next petal. This petal has a little bit of both colors, but it's a pretty small shape again. So I'm going to go in with this pink purple first, and then before it dries, I'll add a little bit of that red by tapping it in on top. So I'm trying not to go too slow. That way it doesn't have a chance to dry. I'm also being mindful of how much paint I'm bringing in. I'm allowing it to be relatively thick, and I'm okay with letting some puddles be at this early stage. That ensures it doesn't completely dry out on me too soon. Now that the whole petal is covered with that pink purple, I can grab some of the red because things are still wet. And just along that top edge, I can tap in some of the reds. If there's puddles that I'm concerned about, I can just soak those up using a dry brush. Now I can't paint the top edge here because it's in contact with the area I just painted, but I can paint the end here because there's a fold. So I'm going to go in with my pink purple right onto the dry paper again. I want there to be a fold here that kind of cuts across. Once the pink purple's in, I'm going to grab a little bit of red and just tap that in through the center. If there's puddling of paint, I dry my brush off on a sponge or paper towel and I just soak up that excess. Now I can return to this central petal and begin painting the folds. However, there's a lot of areas that are still wet at this moment. So as long as there's no puddles, I can actually come in here with the blow dryer just so I have peace of mind I'm not going to bump into something I shouldn't. So go ahead and hit everything with the blow dryer. Now that everything is completely dry, we can begin working on the folds of the petals. A lot of these petals are very small, so I'm going to be using my small #2 round. So on a couple of these petals on the far side, they're very narrow, but they're softer in color. So I'm going to use that watered down purple lake that I used on the first flower, and I'm just going to put a hint of color in the fold. Painting wet on dry, trying to stay just inside the fold to get a little bit of color there. I'm going to do the same thing on this outside petal. However, when I near the center, I'll switch to a dark color so it looks like it's receding. So then at the very center here, towards the bottom, I'm going to get a darker color and tap it on top of the wet purple, just so it looks a little darker. I'm going to continue with this lighter purple lake. With this next fold, I'm going to be pretty heavy-handed just to make sure I have time to get the color in. So I'm allowing just a little bit of puddling, but I'm working from left to right. And once I get to the right, I don't backtrack because I don't want brush strokes. As I get close to the center of the flower, I am going to tap in some darker reds on top of this lighter purple. So again, it looks like it's receding to the center of the flower. So as long as things are still wet and glossy, you can kind of tap your brush in to create that value change. I'm going to jump up to this fold here. It's very narrow, using that lighter purple lake. Soak up any puddling. I'm going to hop over to this petal at the top, starting with the lighter purple lake. While things are very glossy, I'm going to get some of that darker red. And just on that far left edge of this fold, I'm going to darken it up. So I'm just tapping my brush just on the inside of that edge while the purple is still wet. I'm going to be doing the same thing on this next fold. Applying the purple lake. As long as things are glossy, you can grab some of that dark red and just on that left edge, I can tap in some of that red to darken it up. As long as everything is still wet, you can dry your brush off and you can kind of control where the shadow is and your gradient by kind of pushing the colors around on the wet surface. Coming into this next fold, trying to allow just a little bit of puddling of the paint while I'm painting wet on dry, just so it doesn't dry too fast. So it gives me time to kind of tap in a couple areas of darker color. So right in the very center, closest to the white flower, I'm just going to tap in some darker reds on the wet surface. I'm going to now come back to the pink flower on the left and paint the remaining fold. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. While everything's wet, I'm grabbing that dark red, and just at the center, I'm going to darken it up. I'm going to come all the way to the top and paint this remaining petal that I see just a sliver of. I'm going to use that pink purple mixture. Now I need to add some values to the folds of the white flower. Right now we have some areas that are a little damp yet, so I'm going to hop over and paint the stem to the pink flower on the left while we're waiting. I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna, which is kind of like an orangish brown. And I'm going to use a little bit of burnt umber as well at the end. So first I'm going to go into the stem with this burnt sienna, painting wet on dry. And then while that stem is wet, I'm going to grab some of the burnt umber. And I'm just going to tap in a couple shadows on the stem. And I can always push the color around on the wet surface with a clean, dry brush. So as long as things are damp, you can kind of mix your paint and create your values and gradients on the wet surface. Okay, I'm now going to return to the folds of the white flower. I'm using a number 2 round. I need to apply clean water to the fold. So I'm starting at the top center fold. Things nearby are already dry, so it's safe to paint this. Now at the very bottom of this petal, I want there to be some yellows. And then just right through the very center of this fold, I want there to be some purples. So I'm going to grab some of that purple lake and right through the center, I'm just going to tap my brush so it releases some of the color through the center of that fold. And then I'm going to get some cadmium yellow. And nearest to the center, I'm going to get some bright yellows in. Moving on to the next flower fold, going in with clean water. I want a little bit of that purple lake color towards the bottom edge of this fold. And then I want it to come back and then around and meet up. And then nearest to the center, I want that cadmium yellow. If you need to on the wet surface, you can use a clean, dry brush to kind of blend the colors on a wet surface. Getting some clean water on the next fold. Grabbing that lighter purple lake, and on the bottom edge of this fold, I'm applying that color. And then right on the inside, just a little bit of yellow. Coming to the very bottom fold. This one is very much more just purple lake on its own. So I'm coming into the dry surface with purple lake on my brush, no water, and I'm just filling in this fold. I'm going to hop over to the petal on the far left because it's not in contact. This one's darker as well, so I'm just going to come in with that purple lake. And as long as the stem is completely dry, you can paint right up next to it. I'm going to get water on my brush. I'm going to apply clean water to the fold above. Be mindful if you have little water droplets hanging out on the metal ferrule of your brush. They love to drop at the most inconvenient times. So I have purple lake on the upper left edge of this fold, and then it kind of recedes into white as it nears the center. As I get closer to the center, I'm going to add the tiniest bit of yellow. And at the very top of this fold, there should be a little corner just peeking out at the very top. So I'm going to grab some purple lake. And paint that in. And then we've got this one fold down here at the bottom. This fold is a lot of white, so I'm not going to be very heavy-handed with my color. So I'm just coming in with some water. In the very center, we want some yellows. At the very outside edge, I'll put just a small amount of some of that lighter purple lake. You can always use a clean, dry brush to kind of blend your colors on the wet surface. So now I'm going to take a moment to look at the folds and make sure I have the contrast I want. This fold of the white flower, I feel like the contrast isn't strong enough. So I'm going to use that light purple lake and just the tiniest bit of paint on my brush. And I'm going to paint just a thin sliver of purple along the edge of that fold for contrast. I'm going to do the same thing along this fold here. Same with this fold here. This one is not dry yet. But now I can go to the center of this flower and push the darks of the reds right in the center. So I'm going to use the dark red I mixed up in the very beginning, and I don't want this color to get on any of the folds. So I'm being mindful of them. And I just want to push the darks in the center of this flower more. Once I have some darks in there, I can rinse my brush and tap a sponge. And just on the outer edge of that dark color, I can use some water to just blend that color ever so slightly. Keep in mind, my brush was barely damp, okay? So I did not bring in a lot of water. It doesn't take much. If I bring in too much water, it's going to kick back in my color and it will defeat the purpose. So finding the right amount of water just takes practice. Now I'm going to grab some cadmium yellow, and just on the outer edge of the reds, I'm going to push some of my yellows to be darker. I'm avoiding the folds. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the yellows that I did to the reds. Rinse my brush, make sure it's barely damp, and then I'm going to come to the upper edge of those yellow paint strokes, and I'm just going to soften it and do some blending so there isn't such a hard stop point to the colors. And then last but not least, I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer, and I have one more step I want to do to the center of this flower. So now I'm going to use some of the darker reds, and I'm going to water it down just a smidge so it's a glaze. And I want to just put a glaze of color over the folds near the center. Now I'm going to rinse my brush completely, tap my sponge to remove the excess water, and I'm just going to create this little bit of a fade. Because even those folds would be in shadow towards the very center of the flower. So we need just the smallest amount of color to them. So you can use a barely damp brush and you can kind of come into the fold and you can push down towards center just to soften that shadow color. And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Do let me know in the comments. Share it with friends, give me a thumbs up, and subscribe to follow along. Have a fantastic week.